Barbara Brown Taylor is a best-selling author, teacher, and Episcopal priest, Anglican priest, but in the United States. She has served congregations, and she's also been a full-time professor at theological schools. In 2010, she wrote a book called An Altar in the World, A Geography of Faith, in which she explores ways to discover the sacred in everyday activities. Since most of us are homebound these days, or at the very least prevented from attending church and other gatherings, I thought it could be helpful for us to make our way through her book and see how her chapters interact with the scripture lessons and with our lives over the next 12 weeks. In her introduction, Barbara tells a story about an older priest who invited her to come and speak to his church. When she asked him what she should speak about, he answered this way: "Come tell us what is saving your life now. Come tell us what is saving your life now." She felt incredibly freed by this answer, to be able to simply speak of her personal experience. She says in her book, "The answers I gave all those years ago are not the same answers I would give today. That is the beauty of the question. But the principle is the same. What is saving my life now is the conviction that there is no spiritual treasure to be found apart from the bodily experiences of human life on earth. My life depends on engaging the most ordinary physical activities with the most exquisite attention I can give them. My life depends on ignoring all touted distinctions between the secular and the sacred, the physical and the spiritual, the body and the soul. What is saving my life now," she said, "is becoming more fully human, trusting that there is no way to God apart from real life in the real world." And so, with that introduction, each chapter of her book focuses on a certain practice, an exercise in being a human being with a body and a soul, and an exploration of how that practice might deepen our awareness of God and the holy. And so we begin with chapter 1, the practice of waking up to God, or another word for it, vision. In chapter 1, Barbara Brown Taylor reflects on the story of Jacob in the Bible, who was running away from home because he had scammed his father out of the birthright and blessing meant for his older brother. That brother, Esau, was enraged, and Jacob fled for his life. While sleeping rough in the wilderness, he has a visionary dream of a ladder reaching right up to heaven, and angels ascending and descending upon it, and God's voice promising him relationship, safety, children, and a homeland. When Jacob wakes up, he says, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." The story is in some ways similar to our gospel reading this morning about the Emmaus Road. Cleopas and an unnamed disciple encounter a stranger on the road. They share their story of loss, engage in a scripture discussion, and then invite him to stay and eat with them. As the stranger prays over the bread and then breaks it for sharing, they suddenly can see that it is Jesus, and then he disappears. Then, like Jacob, they can look back and see that the Holy was at work. "Were not our hearts burning within us," they say, "while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" This scripture is from Luke's Gospel and is Luke's first post-resurrection appearance story. In Luke's Easter morning story, the women return to the tomb to find that the stone has been rolled away and Jesus' body gone. They encounter angels who tell them that Christ is risen, but they do not get to see him. The women return to tell the disciples, but as the scripture says, the women's words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. Only Peter goes to the tomb to confirm that it is empty. And so it is that the risen Christ appears first in Luke to two lesser-known disciples, Cleopas and another, perhaps Cleopas's wife, perhaps another man. They encounter Jesus post-resurrection, but like Mary in John's Gospel, they do not recognize him at first. Their sight is blurred by their grief and distress, and it is only when the bread is blessed and broken that they are able to see clearly. The road is made holy as they look back on it and see that Jesus had walked it with them. How do we wake up to the presence of God when even those standing in front of Jesus cannot see him, at least at first? It's actually a comfort to me to know that human beings have always had trouble discerning the presence of the holy. The scriptures tell us many tales of the fantastic lengths that God goes to get someone's attention. A bush that burns brightly but isn't consumed, a persistent call in the middle of the night that wakes you up repeatedly, an angelic appearance, a crazy vision, a storm, a dream. The list goes on. When Jacob says, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it," there was no temple in Jerusalem. Barbara Brown Taylor reminds us that for hundreds of years, the divine presence was content to be carried in a tent, camping with people who were on the move. When King David proposed building a temple, a permanent site, God was not impressed, and so the project was delayed. Not that there is anything inherently wrong with marking the places we have encountered God. Jacob placed a stone at the site of his vision and named it Beit El, Bethel, house of God. Millions of human beings each year visit shrines and temples and synagogues and churches, trusting that these are thin places where God has shown up before. They are places of beauty and community and service. The drawback of creating houses of worship, however, is that we can start to believe that these are the only places God is. We can create a misguided distinction between the holy and the everyday, the sacred and the ordinary. And it can lead to missing out on all the places and times and people in whom God chooses to be present. We can fail to see God in our kitchen, in our backyard, in our neighbor, in the trees and rivers. Barbara Brown Taylor tells of joining a church community as a teenager and being taught that only the Bible was the source of truth, and to be suspicious of the material world, the world of the flesh. She remembers learning somehow that her body and the natural world were part of this world of the flesh that tempted us and could not be trusted. Just as the church was holier than the world, so the Spirit was holier than the flesh. I wonder, does any of that resonate with your experience in the church? Fortunately, as Barbara Brown Taylor studied the Bible, she learned that God chooses to be part of the natural world, not to ignore it, to show up in whirlwinds and starry skies and strangers. Jesus tells folks to pay attention to flowers and birds, and women needing bread and workers lining up for their pay. He takes the reality of people's lives and shows them where God lives and how God calls. It is very possible to be a faithful reader of Scripture and come to the conclusion that we can learn about God just as much from what happens in the day-to-day material world as we can from the Bible. And one points to the other. The practice of waking up to the presence of God is not like turning on a light switch. It is an attitude that must be practiced. And most often, if the stories are true, we see the presence of God in hindsight, in that far-out dream, or in that stranger walking with us on the road. Our visions will most often come to us unasked for, and our role is to sharpen our awareness, to trust that God will try to speak to us, and to look for clues. If we truly want to wake up to God, we will listen to our bodies as much as we listen to our minds. We will trust our innate connection to the physical world. And we will expect God to show up as we eat, as we sleep, in our conflicts, in our loves, in our daily routines, and breaking news. And when we wake up and remember our dream, or look back in wonder at that conversation we had at the doctor's office, or listen to the wisdom of our gut, and perceive that God has been there, let us be like Jacob and give thanks and set a stone to mark the moment. Or like Cleopas, let us rush to share the news with friends, sharing the good news that God continues to come to us, offering relationship, hope, and a new way of being in the world. Thanks be to God. Amen.